episode 2 of the Erie Total Performance Podcast. Jeff Lewis from Lewis Fitness and Performance.
Cam White from DLB Elite.
Today we're going to kind of dig into a little bit of our training system at Lewis Fitness and Performance and really kind of get down into the weeds as far as what we're looking to improve in the athletes that come into our program, and really why that is instrumental to the success of a program like DLB Elite, and kind of just give you a full background. We'll put some examples in there as well as far as what our overall goal and overall process is with our business. I'm going to kind of give the host role over to you, and I'll start kind of answering some questions as far as what we're all about.
Sweet. So if you have an athlete come into the gym, take us through your process from start to finish, kind of how you go about your strategy session, what you do, and all that.
Sure, absolutely. The initial process that we start every member who walks through the door is they start with what's called a strategy session, and that's really an information gathering session for us. So we want to learn as much about why they're interested in what we do, and then find some information that will help us guide them through their own individual process. Because there's no real cookie cutter method to kind of get somebody started. We have to learn what makes them ticks, what their goals are, their health and injury history, some things that may have happened throughout their athletic career that we need to take into account when we're going to put a program in front of them. And so it really starts with that session. And part of that session, on top of just kind of getting to know them and their why, is we're going to take them through a movement assessment. Fairly basic, non-strenuous, so not really working out the first time we meet them. But we need to really get a firm picture of the way that they move, kind of the foundation of how they move. And that really dictates the pathway that we're going to put them on, from a training standpoint, so that we can, really kind of work on their weaknesses, and then that's kind of layered in with, just kind of the general developmental processes that they all really need to upgrade when it comes to like more traditional methods that way. And so that's really our goal of that, real initial process. And as far as our assessment, that has evolved, really just as much as the training system, kind of over the years. So we start with the functional movement screen, which is, it's 7 exercises that just kind of, it's a snapshot of how they move. So we use kind of the comparison, like you go to the doctor and they take like your vitals, like your heart rate, your blood pressure, height and weight. Like they do all of those things, to just get a little snapshot of where you are from your overall health. So we do that with movement using the functional movement screen. So essentially what blood pressure will give you in regard to your cardiovascular health, the functional movement screen is, basically that for, kind of your movement profile. And then we're going to utilize that to kind of put a plan, forward. And that has been since the start of our business. We've always done that because it really helps us generate that first program.
Right.
That way. So, that's kind of how we get things started. I could get into like the evolution of that. If
you want to go into kind of your training system, we kind of touched on it last episode, but just go into like exactly what it is and what does like FRC stand for.
Sure. Yeah. So like FRC stands for functional range conditioning. It's a part of the functional range system. And from an evolutionary standpoint of our training system, that has been the biggest change. We're big on continuing education, kind of searching for, better methods, better implementations of scientific principles, in the strength and conditioning space. And that has really, unlike any other kind of educational process, that has changed what we do on a daily basis. And we're probably going back almost a decade now to when we first got introduced to it, which did start with functional range conditioning. So it's essentially, from its most simple definition, it's a formalized training system to improve mobility. And that's part of the way that you move. And so that is a big part of our system. And it's also a big part of our assessment process. So we're not just going to do those 7 exercises, bodyweight exercises of the functional movement screen. We'll do that, and then we'll look at some things a little more specifically when it comes to how certain joints move. And those come from the functional range system, as far as, again, getting more information at the beginning to help guide us through the initial programming stage, of really finding the right starting line for each athlete. So we're going to look at, how do your hips move, how does your spine move, how does your shoulder move, how does your ankle move, and again, that's going to be predicated on a lot of the information we get in that strategy session. If somebody comes in with an ACL tear, a previous ACL tear, or a history of ankle sprains, we'll just get out kind of a finer tooth comb when it comes to assessing the joint that was previously affected from an injury, because all those things matter. The greatest predictor of injury is a previous injury, and so we want to do our due diligence based on the information we initially get, to really just look at things a little more specifically, so that the programming can reflect their actual needs. Because most young athletes, when they come in typically with their parents, they're looking for just general strength and conditioning goals. They need to get stronger, they need to get faster, change of direction. So it's not uncommon for somebody to just shoot us a message and be like, "Do you do speed and agility programs?" Sure we do. But that is going to be a different type of program depending on that human being.
Right.
And they deserve that. They don't just deserve, we'll push some sleds, work on acceleration principles, we'll get out some cones, work on change of direction, and hopefully by the end of today's podcast, that's a little more clear as to, like, okay, why does each individual deserve their own pathway towards improvement? Because there's a lot of factors when we're dealing with the human body. And so we look through all of that, and it doesn't take that long. It's one that we've refined that process to where, in 15, 20 minutes, kind of have a full snapshot of how an athlete moves, and where we're going to go from there. Like I mentioned in the first episode, like, if people are talking to me, out and about, I go to a game, and it's like, "Oh, I want my kid to join your program. Like, how would you help him?" It's like, well, I have no idea until we go through this process. I need 20 minutes, and then I'll have a firm, crystal clear idea of what they need. But just in a casual conversation, I don't really know. And that's why that strategy session is imperative, to getting off the starting blocks, and into the strength and conditioning world, because it's you don't have to do it that way, but it's the way we do it, because the best way to attack weaknesses and get results as efficiently as possible is to really look at it in a pretty simplistic way when you step back and look at it, but it's necessary to be able to get that information and then kind of move forward in the right direction.
Going off of that, kind of the whole purpose of the podcast is to bridge the gap between LFP and DLB.
Mm-hmm.
So take us through how FRC and what you do here will help DLB and what I do.
Absolutely. So the best way, I'm kind of a visual learner, I think most people are. So the best way to look at it is to just look at development from sort of a 5,000-10,000 foot view. And so essentially, like, the way that it looks, here on the screen is like DLB Elite is looking at optimizing skill development for football players, defensive linemen, linebackers. Like, that's the goal of that program, is to increase the skill. But ultimately, when we look at athletic development, it's built like a pyramid, just like this. I know these are a little bit small, but essentially the base of the pyramid is the foundation of movement. And so those are the things that we just discussed, as far as, your movement profile when it comes to, like, your FMS score, mobility, stability, your fundamental movement skills, which is essentially just a baseline developmental process that's typically built through the physical education pedagogy in the school systems, as far as skipping, jumping, swimming, kind of those just basic, athletic skills that hopefully there's some development, at that point, but not always. And then just kind of looking at your tissue structure, like where do improvements need to be made? That's the foundation of the pyramid. And obviously, if you want to build that pyramid to the highest height possible, the foundation needs to be robust, and solidified so that we can build on top of it. And in the middle is your kind of functional performance. Those are really your standard thoughts when it comes to strength and conditioning. So we look at, a lot of these are like essentially the goals of the initial contact that we'll make with people. Like, oh, I want to work on change of direction or agility. I want to work on speed. Maybe they have strength concerns, power development, core stability. Like those are the things that are in the middle. And the traditional strength and conditioning program that's what it's going to be. Where you're kind of missing the actual foundation of the pyramid. And then obviously the sports skill is built on top of that. So the more robust we can build the bottom and the middle of that pyramid really dictates the success of the skill development work. And that's, in today's day and age, we want to build it like this, but ultimately we see a lot of it built like this, where there's a big predisposition to just work on the skill of your sport. So like we're working on the skill of our sport within the practice models and things like that. But it's like, oh, I'm going to hire a coach to work with my, young defensive lineman.
Right.
And it's like, that's great. It's necessary in order to develop those skills. But a lot of times that's the sole focus of like the extra work that we're going to put in, the extra opportunities we're going to put in front of our young athletes in order to develop them. And it ends up being built upside down, where they're spending so much time working on skill, they don't have a whole lot of extra free time to work on the standard kind of strength and conditioning model. And they don't really work on the foundation really at all, in most programs that don't have essentially the full knowledge base to know the importance of why it needs to be built right side up. From a physics standpoint, it's pretty simple to understand. We want to build a pyramid like this because eventually this works for a little bit. Like we're going to develop highly skilled athletes. But usually as we move from middle school to high school, then you're going to see the physical nature of most sports kind of take over and the pyramid topples over. As far as they just don't have the ability to either acquire or apply certain skills because they're underdeveloped because they built it upside down, that way. So this is kind of a good kind of overall picture of what our goal is as a business, and on the opposing side, kind of the picture of the normal process that a lot of athletes go through. And you can pick any sport and you can kind of see that, to where it's like, we have some blind spots in the overall development of athletes to where most of them come in built like this, especially from my point of view where, obviously we're working with young athletes of all sports, male, female, all different, sports. But I also am a strength and conditioning coach for a college basketball team at Mercyhurst. And so I see those guys at 18, 19, 20, 21, 22,
right.
Where I'm going to essentially meet them for the first time. And when I kind of talk to them and discuss their overall development, what they've done, in a weight room setting, I kind of see this more oftentimes than not, to where it's like, okay, we're at sort of a ceiling of what we can do from a skill developmental side on a basketball court, unless we can kind of flip this over and really build from the bottom up. Not the way you can build a pyramid, but
right.
We can kind of do that as far as really focusing on essentially the correct way to build an athlete. And therefore when we do that, we increase the likelihood of developing higher skill levels, which obviously we need as a Division I basketball program to be able to do that. So it's one of those where the earlier you gain an understanding of this and the importance of this, the better.
Right.
That way. Because that's always kind of a question we get a lot is like, when is the right time to start a young athlete? Like, there's never a bad time to start working on the bottom. It's like, that's elementary, gym class. Like we're building that. But my kids have PE once every 6 days. So like they're not highly exposed. They're going to have, essentially like 30 gym classes a year. So it's really not a ton of exposure to be able to really just say, oh, well, they do that in gym class. They do a little bit of that. They get a small exposure to it, and it's not as robust as what they need.
Right.
Because it's gym class.
Right.
Like sometimes we just roll the ball out there and we just run around. So it's one of those things where a diligent training system that is focused not only on this, but specifically, what do you need? What are you missing in your foundation compared to the next kid? So then we can do it even more efficiently, because we have to build an efficient training system because we don't have unlimited time.
Right.
We don't. Like the amount of athletes that come through here and be like, oh yeah, I want to train 4 days a week. Few and far between. Especially over the last 5 years, most of our 4-day athletes are either getting paid or trying to get paid to continue their sport. There's not too many middle school kids who come in here and be like, oh yeah, I'll be in here 4 days a week. If you can, great. But for the most part, it's 2 days a week. And so we have to make the most out of that time as far as really building this as efficiently as we possibly can.
And FRC, what you do specifically focuses on that bottom pillar.
Yeah. And we're layering in the middle as well.
Right.
We work those concurrently, but there's a direct focus, from the teachings of that system, in our application on a daily basis. We have to attack that. Because this is kind of the simplistic view of what it is. What it actually looks like, the base of this triangle is here. We're going to further break that down, when it comes to the functional range system, into how do your specific joints function, your absolute strength profiles, both kind of holistically as a total body or maybe just lower body, upper body, pretty standard model, to how strong do your hips rotate, because from a more of a joint specific standpoint. Your reactive strength, your ability of your connective tissue to handle, absorb, and produce loads, because from an injury prevention standpoint, that's paramount. We have processes in our system that will directly look at improving connective tissue structure and its load-bearing capacity. Like we need to have those things. And then how fast can your muscles contract and relax? And that's kind of one of the paramount things when you look at athleticism. Your best athletes do that better. Right. We have processes in our system that are going to train that directly. And so this gives us a lot of tools from a programming standpoint to give an athlete exactly what they need, to further solidify the base of this overall pyramid, that way. So it's, again, these are part of the evolution of our training system, are getting really hyper focused on these buckets so that we can identify the ones that are a little empty or could use a little bit more in them. Maybe identify ones that have been pretty well developed.
Right. And we'll touch on that later.
Absolutely.
Like you need all 4 of these, and we see like a lot of times these 2 buckets are full and we're missing these 2.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's your traditional model. We'll fill these 2 buckets. Because we're doing maximum strength work. So we're filling that bucket. We're doing explosive exercise. We have Olympic lifts. We have plyometrics incorporated into a standard, strength and conditioning program. So these buckets are pretty full. And a lot of times the joint structure, the connective tissue, they're untrained. And that's why we see at the professional levels of sports, we see pretty impressive specimens.
Right.
Because they've filled these buckets. And genetically they might have a bigger bucket than most. But they also tend to get injured at a higher rate. Mm-hmm. And just looking at injury statistics, like you see that, then not just kind of throwing that out there. It's like they're there. And then obviously at the professional level, your biggest, fastest, strongest physical specimens tend to get paid the most.
Right.
Deservedly so.
Right.
But if they're injured, like these professional sports, they're running like businesses. If I invest $20 million a year into this player and they're always hurt, and they can't be productive in what we need to do, what we've hired them to do, that's a problem. And so, they're kind of essentially, maybe without even knowing it, reaching out to our industry, being like, hey, what can be done about this? And so we just, again, goes back to that strategy session. We're going to look to see, okay, where do we need to go? Because ultimately, if I take somebody through a strategy session and I get a picture of everything, it essentially looks like this, where I'm going to kind of pinpoint, areas, where they move fine. They have good joint structure, their movement pathways are good, and those are kind of represented by the green dots on this structure. And then we might have some that, they don't move well. We see limitations when we take them through the movement assessment, and those are essentially the black dots on here. And then the red ones are where we have kind of that dysfunction, but that's also associated with some level of pain. Or if we've had a previous injury, right. We could probably label that as a red joint. Where at one point this was highly painful to where we had to have, kind of a full, orthopedic intervention come into play. And so this is essentially the most simplistic of a picture that we can kind of put out of there as far as the result of that movement assessment. As we kind of get this kind of a picture, and then obviously I need to look at it as far as from a programming standpoint. Okay, we need some knee stuff here. The right knee doesn't move well, but if I have pad pain, I might attack that a little bit differently. As far as essentially the progressive nature of that program, right, is going to be a little bit different, just because that joint not only is compromised from a movement standpoint, but there's been a pain response, or there is a pain response. And so those have to maybe be a little bit more conservative in how we attack that movement weakness, kind of that way. So that's really the overall goal. We want to take this snapshot of each individual that comes through here, and then obviously the goal is to move them to that. We have their joint function be as optimal as we can be. Because then that person we can take through our system, with very high efficiency. As far as we're just progressing everything one program to the next without having to, really attack certain areas. We can get a little more holistic, but that takes time. And it's a different amount of time for you compared to me, compared to Jimmy, right, compared to Johnny. They all deserve, again, their own pathway to move down. And that's, kind of how our system, is really built. That way.
So let's talk about how, joint function and joint specific training ultimately leads to the athlete moving better, CNS output, better skill development.
Sure. Visual learner. So the best way that we can kind of picture this is, we mentioned buckets. So these are essentially, they're represented by a circle here, but these are those, kind of 4 buckets, and they're all interconnected. So we are going to assess that, but also we're still trying to fill all of these buckets. But the key to our system is we recognize the importance of all 4 of them, and we're going to fill them accordingly. If somebody's joint bucket has never been addressed, it's essentially empty, and we need to pour into that, pun intended, as far as that, is a big bulk of their program. As far as taking that athlete who showed up like this to get them here. So we need to fill that bucket. And then we cannot ignore connective tissue. Because that's essentially the blind spot at the professional level. Is we have these physical specimens, these athletes that they have huge strength capacities. Their nervous system is elite in how it functions. Their muscle tissue is developed. They have immense amount of hypertrophy. They're bigger, faster, stronger. They have all of those qualities, but they don't have a connective tissue system that can support that force development. And so they blow through it. And that's why at the professional level, the vast majority of your injuries are not catastrophic in nature. They're more overuse type connective tissue, soft tissue injuries, are prevalent, at really every professional sport. It's because their training doesn't actually develop that. And it also inherently develops qualities that are going to expose that even more. And so those are things that we need to address in the training process and prevent injury. It's not going to be like basketball's big in like load management, to where it's like at a certain point, in a load management profile, we have to take Steph Curry and have him sit out for the next 3 games, because it's something's starting to break down, and like that's the game plan, and it's backwards.
Right.
Again, if we're not filling this bucket, it's going to rear its head at some point. So the training system, through the entire training process needs to address that. That's what load management actually needs to be, is a full and complete strength and conditioning process that they're going to go through so that they are able to effectively handle the rigors of their sport.
Right.
And then also have time away from it to where this can get ramped up. Like the problem with the over-skilled athlete is they tend to participate in their sport sometimes year-round. And that, is a big caveat in the overall equation, is that because they don't take time away from it, they can never really ramp this process up. Even for the athletes that we have going through this process, sometimes they can't do it. So instead of being 2 days a week and bump up to 3 days when they're in the off season, they just kind of do like 1 time a week. And it's like, okay, great, but we can never really ramp this up because they don't have enough exposure to it. And because they're only doing 1 time a week because they also have 4 practices and 3 skill development sessions and only 1 strength and conditioning session.
Right.
That way. So it's better than nothing, but it's not efficient, in giving them exactly what they need in the right dosages of what they need. They're overskilled still. Even though we're trying to patch the foundation, you keep building the top, there's only so much I can do, when it comes to that. So these 4 buckets are what create a human system that builds strength as what we call an emergent behavior. All of these things add to the ability to produce force and produce a strength output, which is essentially, in this diagram, the output is essentially the skill. So what are you trying to develop with DLB Elite is certain outputs. If we don't have the developmental foundation, the output's going to be what it is. It could be something that they've never done before, they never knew was a thing,
right.
And it's like, okay, now this is a thing. They can do this certain technique, but again, is it going to be optimized? Not if they're not addressing what's underneath. Essentially the new definition of strength as an emergent behavior that comes, from the synergy between these 3 buckets or 4 buckets. We need all of them in order to fully optimize what the output can be. And the best outcome can be is when we're doing all the things, we see this as a fairly seamless process. It's like, oh, I'd never heard of this before. I'd never done it. I didn't know it was a thing. You drill it a couple times, but they have the foundation as a human being to be able to optimize that fairly quickly. And that's essentially what skill development is.
Right.
Is if you move well, you have good strength qualities, your joints function optimally, your connective tissue, is robust enough and resilient enough to be able to handle all the things you ask of it. It's like, okay, yeah, I got it.
Right.
And now you can take that bench press and actually apply it on the football field. Because your ankle, knee, and hip function optimally to connect you to the ground, to use the ground, to take that bench press and lock the guy out or whatever you're trying to work on with that. If you don't have those, you're not going to be able to do that as much.
Right.
It's like, oh, I can't long arm guy. It's like, I got to do more bench press.
Right.
Do you? Or is it something else?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or it's like specific terms. We talk about turning our toe, and like what I teach, and we could drill it 1,000 times, but if we don't have the joint function, or we talk about those red joints,
if the ankle doesn't do it,
they're not going to get it.
If you're showing up this way, like that guy's not going to be able to create, bend an edge, that leads directly to the quarterback. Right. They're not going to be able to do it. Right. It doesn't matter if they can bench press 400 pounds, squat 500 pounds. They don't have the joint structure to align their body to apply force correctly the way you're teaching it.
Right.
Yeah, because their body doesn't move that way.
Yeah.
And that creates a very challenging environment for both the athlete. You know, say it's an athlete, obviously if it's that kid, 400-pound bench press, 500-pound squat, this kid will work. They'll put the work in. They want to improve, but they're not focused directly where they need to. You know, so they get frustrated because they can't do what you're directing them to do as a coach. You get frustrated as a coach because you think this kid's a stud. They should be able to grasp this concept and, you know, get 2 sacks a game, no problem. But it's just the limiting factor that we just ignored how their ankle functioned, and they actually can't do what you want them to do.
Right.
They are unable to acquire the skill because they don't have the architecture that allows them to do it, you know, that way. So we create this environment from a coach and an athlete that has this underlying frustration because everybody wants to make it work, but it's not the drill. It's not, I got to bench press more.
Right.
You know, it's an ankle issue. The ankle joint doesn't do ankle things, and therefore, like, you're going to move the way you move.
Right.
And if it's not well, there's the limiting factor.
Right.
So that needs to be addressed. And most programs, from a strength and conditioning standpoint, they're not going to address that.
Right.
It's like, oh, my ankles and hips don't move really well. Well, we're going to squat real deep, and it'll get better. No, it will not, because it's not direct. The ankle and the hip are involved in the squatting movement,
Right.
but it doesn't make them better.
Yeah.
Yeah, it requires them to be great in order to do that. So most likely that athlete who's in a program where it's like, oh, well, we're going to squat, you know, below parallel. Chances are you're doing more harm than good.
Right.
Like, yeah, you might build some quad development, some glute development, but you also might continue to break down this joint. You know, maybe it's the knee where it's black, but then it becomes red. Now, and how often does that happen? Like, yeah, I had to stop squatting because it hurt. Eventually it hurt. It's like, well, yeah, because you didn't address the underlying joint requirements in order to squat below parallel.
Right.
You know, so it's one of all of those get taken into account. Yeah, when we create a snapshot of each athlete and what they need, but our program is going to attack those. Yeah, so where it's directing us to attack certain joints, like, that's the focus of the program. It's like, yeah, we're still going to do, you know, horizontal pressing with this athlete. You know, like, maybe.
Right.
You know, with that little guy right there. But, yeah, we're still going to develop all those things. They don't just go completely to the back burner, but they don't just sit there on the front and we just hammer the front burners. Like, we have to prioritize things because ultimately, if we want to get this, these things have to be addressed. Yeah, because they all interplay with the human system. And this is going to take that athlete who comes in with, let's just call it poor movement profile. And so the way that skill development works is the brain actually gets information from the body. It's what we call afference. And so the brain takes that information. But if we have garbage information, it's the same thing like in computer science, like garbage in. If you don't provide the central processor the right information, it's not going to give you what you want. And that happens in the human system as well. So we get this, you know, kind of poor afference from these dysfunctional joint structures. And so what the brain and the neurology does with that information, you know, it's compressed. So you see the arrows kind of coming in. And then so the motor output, or the efference, the signal it sends to the biology, which is also compressed because we have joints that don't work, you see how that's compressed. You know, like, you're not going to get everything, all the horsepower out of this engine because it's compressed. The nervous system's compressed. It's not going to send the same signal as if it was cleaned up a little bit. And then what the biology does with that signal is going to be compressed. And so then obviously our outputs are compressed. We're not able to do what we want to do. You know, and so that's, again, this is the system, you know, which is pretty standard. Like, we've done thousands and thousands of movement assessments. Nobody comes in clean from the get-go. There's always something that we can address from a programming standpoint, you know, as far as looking at how they move and going from there. Like,
Right.
There's always something.
And the main point is we can't capitalize here and in what I do if we don't capitalize here.
Correct.
Here,
Yeah.
and what you do.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
exactly how we talk
Yeah.
about bridging the gap.
Yeah. So, yeah, from a parent standpoint, like, we don't look at things with our kids like transactionally. I got 3 kids. I don't look at things transactionally, but like, if I make an investment in my kids' development, like, I want to get a return on the investment. So we could work on DLB Elite. I want my kid to be the best defensive end, in District 10. It's like, if we come in like this and this never gets addressed, we could drill, you're working with them, and like, are they going to get better? Like, sure they are. Like, they're going to learn some things, but are they going to be able to optimize that overall output? No. Like, we have to clean it up here.
Right. And you might get better at the drill,
right,
but you're not getting better here.
Correct.
So what happens in the third and fourth quarter when your mechanics and your fundamentals break down?
Correct.
You're going to go back to the picture before this.
Yes. You go right back to here where the output is compressed. So like, this is essentially what we're trying to create here. If we can clean everything up from a strength and conditioning developmental standpoint, now we send good information to the nervous system. So the central nervous system then takes that good information, creates efficient and effective signals that work with a great organization of the biology, from the joints to the connective tissue to the muscles. We're going to get great information coming down to have that bucket go to work, and we get optimal outputs, that way. And so that's really the picture that we're trying to create, and how these businesses work together.
Right.
Is that if we can clean up the human being from a movement standpoint, from all 4 of those buckets, we're not going to ignore any of them. We're going to address the ones that are lacking. We're going to continue to develop the ones that may come in developed already, which is great, but we always find areas where we can focus on. And that's essentially the biggest differentiator in our program, is we understand those 4 buckets. We understand these here. And we have programming elements to affect all of these. And if we just use a percentage, it's like, we might have 40%, 30%, 15, check my math, that's 100, I think. It's like, okay, we're not going to change, like, that's 100% of output that we're trying to optimize, but like, we still are going to do this.
Right.
It's still a big part of our programming. I have a West Side barbell hat on. Like, we're going to lift weights. We're going to work, with high intensity loads. Like, that's the goal. Because we still need to affect this. But the overall, how did that athlete come in, with that percentage, is they just worked here. And they just kind of had this. But we need to fill these up. So like, there's going to be, if I'm going to break a program down, most of our programs are 9 exercises. It's like, they might have 3 here and 2 here and 1 here and 3 there. And that will effectively, these are all interconnected, that will effectively distribute what the overall programming ecosystem is effectively to increase output.
And a lot of times an athlete might not understand that only having 1 here, like, oh, I'm not getting what I need to get, but having everything else here allows that bucket to fill itself.
Because we'll get that feedback sometimes. Say, hey, well, I was in another program and we did X, Y, and Z that would fall into this bucket. It's like, okay, well, that's how you got to the percentage you were at. Like, I understand that now. Like, that's how that bucket came in, kind of filled up already. But like, did you spend a 6-week block looking at how your ankle dorsiflexion functions? Oh no, we didn't do that at all. I know.
Right.
Because like, this thing, it has nothing in it. We've never actually attacked that from a training standpoint. And the other element I want to bring up is, like, in the mobility space, like, sometimes a lot of this and this gets kind of looked at as like filler exercises. We're going after that. Mm-hmm. Like, if you want to improve your ankle dorsiflexion, like, you're going to have to go after that the same way you go after a 3-rep max on a deadlift. The same intensity level. Force is the language of cells. So like, in order to change at a cellular level, we have to apply immense amount of force. But we're going to do that in a very specific way. That is, the sole purpose is to increase the amount of ankle dorsiflexion. Like, that's is the goal. We're going to apply that training input correctly with the right intensity in order to change that. But like ultimately, like we just have to get out of the mindset that I have to like load up a barbell and move it, because we don't do that here. We do it with the same intensity, but it's just a different tool. But we still apply a lot of what we already know the same exact way. Yeah, that
Right.
way. So it's a little bit of a mindset shift. Yeah, when we bring an athlete in to be like, no, we're not just like working on ankle stuff like in between sets of squat. You know, it's like we're going after this because you told me you had to. Yeah, we assessed you. Yeah, and like you have limited ankle dorsiflexion. Yeah, you maybe got too black. You know, on your movement profile. So we have to go after this. You know, and so that's essentially kind of the overview of how the elements of our training system, you know, really get individualized and then prioritized so that we can create the best outputs from a skill standpoint. Because
Right.
that's still the thing. You know, whether you're, you know, a defensive end, you know, you're a point guard in basketball, you're a midfielder in soccer, like your output's different. But what we need to do in order to optimize that, yeah, are still comprised of these 4 buckets here that we have to really look at. What does each individual athlete need? Because that will lead to the outputs that we want.
Right.
You know, the output is not, oh, I want to be able to, you know, deadlift 1.5 to 2 times my body weight.
Right.
Like, you might do that in our program. That's not the goal. The goal is to create a transferable behavior that is consistently outputted within their sport.
Right.
That's the goal.
Yeah. And from an athlete and a client perspective who trained here, I was an athlete that filled these 2 and didn't focus on these 2.
Yeah.
And found myself with the red and the black joints. And really, like, once I got here, focusing on these 2 helped fill these 2. Like,
Yeah.
what's the answer, right? We talk about turning your toe or flipping your hips or feeling injured. A lot of times it's go see the trainer, stretch, do yoga, but it's this.
Correct.
These 2 right
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, it's filling in the developmental blind spots of your training up to that point. Yeah, like they need to be analyzed. What are they? Yeah, and at what priority do we need to focus on them? And then put that pathway in front of the athlete. Yeah, like that's the recipe for success. And it's not simple. Yeah, like there's a lot that goes into it. But the first and foremost, we need to realize that these 2 things are things that we need to have a priority level of some sort within a program, because most standard strength and conditioning programs do not address this. And if they do, it's typically like, oh yeah, we have this like, you know, warm-up protocol, you know,
Right.
where we're going to warm up to address these things. This is training. This is part of the training process. It needs to be done, yeah, with correct loads, correct intensities, correct volumes. Like it needs to be part of an actual training program. If you're just working out, like you're going to be in these buckets. I do workouts. I go to my high school weight room. Get no offense to anyone who's running those. They don't know this.
Yeah.
You know, like your assistant JV football coach that has the keys to the weight room doesn't understand this. And it's not their fault. It's not their job. You know, they're probably a health teacher and they're the assistant JV coach. So like, that's great. We need those people.
Right.
But their sole goal is not to, you know, deep dive down into the industry of strength and conditioning the way it is for us. You know, and so those why an investment in a program like this is very, very different. You're not just paying to get the same thing you get at your high school. You're paying to get all the things that you're missing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're going to find out what that is specific to each individual. It's not just a cookie cutter football program. Oh, put them on a football program. That's not what it is. You know, they all deserve their own, you know, individual process. And we can analyze what that is, what their needs are, and then put the training elements in front of them that will lead to the ultimate goal, you know, which is that they're a better football player when they walk between the lines.
Right.
You know, they're better set up for success from a performance standpoint, from an injury mitigation standpoint, you know, and then like football is a collision sport. So like we still could get something that happens. You get rolled up into, you know, like we still might have some connective tissue that becomes compromised in some ways. Yeah, because like maybe your knee moved in a way it wasn't designed to based on somebody falling into it. That happens all the time. But the benefit of that scenario is we've injured some tissue, but it's trained. We've worked on this. So trained tissue will always respond better to rehabilitative processes. So it's not preventing injury. We're trying to reduce the likelihood of it because we're creating good movers. But also, if something does happen, it's trained tissue. It responds really, really well. The brain processes that this is tissue's compromised. We have to kind of, like the body responds to that very favorably. The problem is when we focus here and here, most of the time we injure connective tissue that is underdeveloped, which is why the injury occurred. And so now you're going through a rehab process with tissue structures that have never been trained before in their life. And so like that's going to take time. It's like think of how long it took to get results the first time you started lifting weights. Like you feel like you're getting stronger, but ultimately nothing's happening. Like there's no physiological change happening at the cellular level because you've never done it before.
Right.
But once you've trained, to counter that, like once you're in a diligent training process, if you take a couple months off and like, I lost everything. As soon as you get back in, like within 4 weeks, like you're like 90%. Like if you're measuring strength outputs, you have those metrics. It'd take you 4 weeks and you're right back there.
Right.
It comes back right away. Trained tissue. And so that's also cannot be ignored in the importance of a training system like this. Like we're in this bucket. We have diligent training inputs in this bucket. So like if something gets compromised, trained tissue bounces right back up. And we see that, a ton in basketball. Because like I'm not going to prevent an ankle sprain.
Right.
It's just the likelihood of it, it's inevitable. But we have guys go down with an ankle sprain and like bad ones. Like it looks bad and they walk it off. And a lot of times they're right back out there. Or like maybe it's the next day. But ultimately, if you look at the injury incidents, it looks like, they're going to be on crutches in a boot 4 to 6 weeks. See you next month. They're back the next day.
Because the tissue's
trained. Like that's the most predominant injury in the sport of basketball. So obviously, ankle, we're filling these buckets. Whether they need it or not. And again, that's all part of that strategy session of really assessing what they need. Like your ankles move good, but you play basketball, so we're working on it. Like all those things go into creating a sport-specific program. The specificity is really what's the most common injury in your sport? Okay, we're overfilling this bucket. Because it deserves that. Because the sport has, an over and above requirement for that specific joint to function optimally.
Right.
No, it was fun. I appreciate you guys watching. Again, stay tuned for more. We'll dig into it more. There's more layers to the onion here. Thank you.
Sweet.